Hello and welcome to this Heroes of Black Reach tutorial. In this tutorial I'll be looking at firing, and because firing is a big topic then this will be a two-part tutorial. In Heroes of Black Reach, when a unit is activated it can either take a movement action, a firing action, or it can choose to do nothing. And in this tutorial I'll just be looking at the firing action. So before a unit can take a firing action, there are four things that you have to consider. They are the attack type, the line of sight, the range, and the firing arc. Sometimes not all of these will apply, but I'm going to go through each one of these in turn and we'll see how they work. So starting off with attack type. So here we can see Sergeant Tellian. And Sergeant Tellian is an infantry unit, and we can tell that because his defense value has a yellow background. Now in the Heroes of Black Reach there are three different types of units. There's infantry, light vehicles, and heavy vehicles. So before you fire on another unit, you have to make sure that you're allowed to attack that type of unit. So Sergeant Tellian here has a +2 combat value against infantry, a +1 combat value against light vehicles, and a +0 combat value against heavy vehicles. But because he has these modifiers, it means he's allowed to attack any one of those types of units. If we look next at this unit of scouts, we can see that they have a +3 modifier against infantry, a +2 modifier against light vehicles, but crucially they have an X against heavy vehicles. So that means that these scouts cannot fire at heavy vehicles. So when you're looking at your unit and you're considering what to fire on, make sure that the type of unit that you're targeting doesn't have an X against it like the scouts do for heavy vehicles. So the second thing to consider is line of sight. So there are three different symbols that are associated with line of sight. The first symbol is this green triangle with a green eyeball, and that means clear line of sight. The second symbol is this red triangle with a red eyeball. That means obscured line of sight. And on the battlefield, obscured line of sight is denoted with these penalty values, and they are attached to terrain elements. And the larger the penalty, the more the terrain element obscures the line of sight. Next, the third symbol, again a red triangle but this time with a white cross inside it, that means blocked line of sight. And this final symbol is a red triangle with a white diamond, and that means blocked line of sight, but it also blocks indirect fire and grenades. Currently this symbol's only found in the drop zone pack and isn't in the core game. But with some of the new releases that are coming out, they will be using this symbol. I'm not going to say any more about it in this tutorial, but I will look at it in the second part of this firing tutorial. In order to fire at a unit, you must have clear or obscured line of sight. So let's move on to the battlefield and have a look at a few line of sight examples. For this example, we have 3 units of Ultramarines at the bottom of the map and 1 unit of Orcs at the top of the map. And this unit of tactical marines are going to be targeting the Orcs. To determine line of sight, you first have to trace an imaginary straight line from the center of the firing unit to the center of the target unit. So when you're playing the game, it's useful to have something like a ruler that you can use to help you determine line of sight. So once you have that straight line, the next thing to do is to look at all of the squares that it passes through, excluding the square that contains the firing unit and the square that contains the target unit. So you're only interested in any squares in between the units. So here we can see the line passes through this empty square, so that would be clear line of sight, and the next one as well, and that's clear line of sight. So this tactical squad has clear line of sight to these sluggers. So what happens if this other unit of tactical marines tries to target the sluggers? Remember that you have to look at all of the squares that the line of sight passes through. And here the line of sight passes through 4 squares between the tactical marine and the sluggers. So you have to take into account each one of those 4 squares. And in this case, each one of those 4 squares is completely open, and so that unit of tactical Marines has clear line of sight to the sluggers. When it comes to line of sight, there are two key things to remember. The first is that infantry units block line of sight if the firing unit and the target unit are both infantry. And the second thing to remember is that vehicles always block line of sight. So let's see a few examples to illustrate those points. So now we have Sergeant Voralanus at the bottom targeting this unit of sluggers at the top. So if we remember the rule that infantry units block other infantry units, then we can see that this tactical squad that's right in front of Sergeant Voralanus will block his line of sight to the sluggers. So Sergeant Voralanus cannot target those sluggers, and likewise if the sluggers were trying to target Sergeant Voralanus, their line of sight would also be blocked by the unit of tactical Marines. Let's add some vehicles and see how they affect line of sight. So let's look at this tactical squad targeting the sluggers again, but now there is a predator, a vehicle, in the way. And if we remember the rule, vehicles always block line of sight. So that means that this tactical squad now cannot see the sluggers because that vehicle is blocking. Next example, we have the other tactical squad trying to target the truck at the top of the battle grid. Here the sluggers are in front of the truck, but the truck is not an infantry unit, so the sluggers do not block line of sight to that truck. So here the tactical unit does have line of sight to the orc truck. Finally, let's see whether the truck has line of sight to Sergeant Voralanus. Now since the truck occupies 2 squares, then you can choose to draw line of sight anywhere along the line between the centers of the 2 squares that the truck is in. And so you can draw line of sight from anywhere along that white horizontal line between the 2 centers. So at the moment it doesn't matter. Regardless of which line of sight you choose, the orc truck still has line of sight to Sergeant Voralanus. However, things would be different if there was an attack bike right next to the truck. In that situation, there would be a difference depending on where you drew your line of sight. If you drew the line of sight through the attack bike, because the attack bike is a vehicle, it would block line of sight to Sergeant Voralanus. So in that case, the orc player would make sure that they check the line of sight through those infantry units and would still have line of sight to Sergeant Voralanus. So far we've covered clear line of sight and we've covered blocked line of sight. The one we haven't looked at yet though is obscured line of sight. So let's go through a few examples of obscured line of sight. For this example, we have 2 units of tactical Marines and a unit of sluggers. Let's look first at this unit of tactical Marines at the bottom, and they are trying to draw a line of sight to the sluggers. The line passes through this ruined building, and that ruined building has some symbols associated with it. So as the line of sight passes through the building, then the target is slightly obscured. And how much the target is obscured depends on the symbols that are attached to that terrain element. So when a terrain element obscures line of sight, then it's denoted with these red triangles that contain these penalty values, -1, -2, etc. So anytime your line of sight passes through a square that obscures the line of sight, then you'll pick up one of these penalties. For the next example, we'll use the other tactical squad attacking that same unit of sluggers. So again, the line of sight is passing through a terrain element that has some symbols associated with it. This time, however, instead of obscuring line of sight, the symbol is this red triangle with a white cross that we've seen before that means the line of sight is blocked, so they cannot see each other. For the final example, the tactical squad have moved to the bottom of the battle grid, and this time when they target the sluggers, there's quite a lot more building between them and the sluggers. And so you can see that the line of sight passes through 3 squares that are part of that building. So if that unit of tactical Marines does choose to fire at the sluggers, then they're going to be at a significant penalty. That'll be a -6. And we'll look at what that penalty means a little bit later on when we look at resolving a firing action. Let's move on to the third thing that we need to consider before we can resolve the firing action, and that is range. So not only do we have to be able to see the target, but the unit has to have a weapon that's powerful enough to actually reach the target. So let's look at some examples to illustrate range. So for this example we have a slightly larger battlefield, but we have a tactical unit and a sluggers unit again. So let's work out the range between these two units. So to do that, we need to count the squares from the attacking unit all the way into the square that contains the target unit. So in this case, the range between the two units is 7 squares. And when you're working out range, you should try to plot the shortest possible distance between the two units. Most units in the game can hit without penalty up to and including 7 squares. So in this scenario, the tactical squad could hit those sluggers without penalty. If, however, the sluggers moved 1 square over and became 8 squares away, at that point the tactical squad would suffer a penalty if they chose to fire at the sluggers. So the rule is that you get a -2 penalty when a target is 8 or more squares away. So just like obscured line of sight, you can still fire at the target, but you'll receive a penalty if they are outside that 7 square range. Okay, let's have a look at firing in the opposite direction. So this time we're going to try and fire the sluggers at the unit of tactical marines. The sluggers, though, have this symbol on their unit tile. And this symbol tells you that the sluggers have limited range. And the number in red next to that blue arrow tells you what the range for that unit is. So in this case, the sluggers have a range of 4. And so that means the sluggers can only reach this far across the battle grid, and therefore they cannot hit that unit of tactical marines. So that brings us to the final thing we need to consider before we do a firing action. And that final thing is the firing arc. Now the firing arc really only applies to weapons that are fixed in some way. So here we have Sergeant Tellian once again. And as an infantry unit, he can turn around in any direction he wishes and fire. So he has a 360-degree arc of fire. In other words, he has no firing arc to consider. And this is true for most units in the game. However, some units do have a limited firing arc. And there are 2 symbols associated with limited firing arc. The first denotes a 90-degree firing arc, and the second a 180-degree firing arc. So here we can see this mech gun, and that unit has a 90-degree firing arc. So let's have a look at an example of that on the battlefield. So we have the mech gun, and this is its firing arc. And the mech gun can only target units that are inside its firing arc. So if the enemy were to approach that mech gun from the rear, the mech gun would not be able to return fire. So let's have a quick recap of those firing action prerequisites. Firstly, attack type. Is the unit that you're firing with able to attack a unit of that type? Second, line of sight. Do you have clear or obscured line of sight to the target? If your line of sight is blocked, then you cannot target that unit. Third, range. Is your target in range? Or do you have limited range, which means you cannot reach the target? And finally, firing arc. Is your target within the arc of fire of your firing unit? So if all those prerequisites have been met, with or without penalties, then at that point you can go forward and resolve the firing action, and that's what we're going to do next. So for this example, we have Sergeant Vorolanus in this ruined building, and he's targeting this unit of sluggers that are inside this crater. So Sergeant Vorolanus can attack infantry units. He has a clear line of sight to the target is in range, and he has a 360-degree firing arc. At that point then, the attacking unit rolls a die. Then you look at the combat value of the attacking unit, and you add that to the die. Now because this is a simple example, there are no extra bonuses or penalties, so then we move on to the defending unit. And for the defending unit, we look at its defensive value, which in this case is 4. And finally, we add any terrain defensive bonuses onto that defensive value. So because the orc unit is inside a crater, it gets a +1 bonus to its defense. So now we have the score for the attacking unit and the score for the defending unit. All we need to do is compare those. So in this case, the attacking unit has scored 7, the defending unit has a score of 5. In order for the attacking unit to hit and damage the defending unit, it needs to equal or better the defending unit's score. So in this case, the attacking unit successfully hits the defending unit. Let's look now at what happens when a unit gets hit. So here we have a unit of tactical marines, and this skull symbol in the bottom right corner determines what happens when the tactical marines are hit. So the two arrows that are around that skull mean that you should flip the tile over should that unit take a hit. And once you've done that, the tile will look like this. And now that skull symbol in the bottom right corner is no longer a white skull, but it's a red skull. When units that have this red skull are hit, then they are removed from the battle grid. The way that vehicles handle hits is slightly different to the way that infantry do. So for a light vehicle, they typically have the red skull symbol visible right from the start, because when they take a hit, they become a crater on the battlefield. So heavy vehicles can take more damage than light vehicles, but at some point, if that heavy vehicle takes a devastating hit, then that skull symbol at the bottom means that you should flip over the heavy vehicle tile, and at that point the heavy vehicle will become a wreck. So I've just mentioned what happens when a vehicle gets destroyed, but let's look at some of the rules that are specific to firing at vehicles. Units that are attacking heavy vehicles gain a bonus if they attack the rear of the heavy vehicle. So here we can see two units of looters and a predator tank. The predator is a heavy vehicle. So if this unit of looters fires against the predator, then it receives no bonuses. However, if this unit hiding in the rocks fires at the predator, then its line of sight passes through the rear of that vehicle, which means it will gain a +2 bonus to its firing, making it more likely to hit and damage that predator tank. However, this only applies to heavy vehicles. So when Sergeant Voralenus attacks this truck, which is a light vehicle, even though his line of sight passes through the back of the truck, he does not receive any bonuses to his firing. When a heavy vehicle is hit as a result of a firing action, then the way that you work out the damage is a little bit different to the way that you do it for infantry and light vehicles. So here we can see the recruitment option tile for a Rhino, and a Rhino is an ultramarine transport heavy vehicle. All heavy vehicles will have a symbol associated with them that looks like this. For the Rhino, that symbol is green, and we'll look at what that means in a moment. In the game, each heavy vehicle will have a set of damage markers, and there are 4 different sets of damage markers. They are green, yellow, red, and black. When a heavy vehicle takes a hit, the player whose unit is firing rolls a die to determine the damage that's done to the heavy vehicle. So if a vehicle has the green symbol, like we saw for the Rhino, then it will have 2 damage markers. If it has a yellow symbol, it will have 3 damage markers, a red symbol, it will have 4, and the black symbol will be 5. In this column on the right hand side, you can see the back of each one of those damage markers. So after you've rolled the die for damage, you next have to select the damage marker that corresponds to your die roll. So for example, if the vehicle has a green profile and you rolled a 4, then you would pick the green 3 to 5 token and place that on the vehicle. So let's go through and have a look at what the symbols mean on these damage markers. First of all, this symbol. This means that the vehicle is immobilized, so that means it can take no more movement actions. Next are these 2 symbols. They mean that a unit that has that damage marker has to take 2 suppressed markers. This symbol means that the unit's primary weapon is damaged and can't be used for the rest of the game. You can tell it's the primary weapon that's been damaged because that cluster of symbols has a red border. The next symbol is this one, and this means that the secondary weapon has been damaged. Notice this has a yellow border which denotes secondary weapon. Some large vehicles, such as the Land Raider, have 2 primary weapons, and so in this case, either the first primary weapon or the secondary primary weapon would be damaged. So there are 2 ways that a vehicle can be destroyed. Either for the green, yellow, and red damage profiles, you roll a 6, which means you immediately flip the vehicle over to its wrecked side. Or, if subsequent damage to that vehicle results in you rolling the same damage marker, then at that point the vehicle is destroyed and you flip it over to show its wrecked side. To finish off this tutorial, I'm going to go through a more complex firing example that brings together more of the things that we've looked at in this tutorial. So here we have the setup for this more complex example. So in the bottom left we have an Orc unit, the rocket launcher, and that has a suppressed marker on it. Then at the top of the battle grid we have Sergeant Voralanus and a Predator tank. And in this example, the Orc rocket launcher unit is going to try and hit that Predator tank. So let's go through each of the 4 prerequisites and see whether or not that rocket launcher can legally fire at that Predator tank. So the first thing to do is look at the attack type and whether or not the rocket launcher can fire at a heavy vehicle. We see it has a +4 for that, so it can target that heavy vehicle. Next we look at line of sight, and here I've drawn the line of sight between the rocket launcher and the Predator tank. I've highlighted the squares with clear line of sight and with obscured line of sight. So you can see that that orange square, as it passes through the ruined building, will give a -2 modifier. You'll also notice that Sergeant Voralanus doesn't block line of sight to that heavy vehicle. So let's move on to the next prerequisite. The next prerequisite is range, and if we look at the rocket launcher, we can see that it has a limited range of 6 squares. However, the Predator tank is only 3 squares away, so the rocket launcher has range to the Predator tank. Finally, we need to consider firing arc, but in this case the rocket launcher has a 360-degree firing arc, so there's nothing to consider. So we've worked out that the rocket launcher can target that Predator tank. So let's go through and resolve the firing action. So starting with the attacking unit, we look at its combat value against heavy vehicles. And in this case, the rocket launcher has a combat value of 4. Next, the Orc player decides to play a card. This is played for the +1 bonus to its firing action. The next thing to notice is that the rocket launcher is targeting the rear of that heavy vehicle, and so they gain a +2 bonus to their firing. The next thing they do is to roll a die, and the Orcs roll a 5. So currently the Orcs have a score of 12, but we still have a few things to subtract. So we saw previously that the line of sight is obscured, and it passes through 1 square in that ruined building, which means that the Orcs get a -2 penalty to their attack. Finally, the Orc unit has a suppressed marker, which means it takes another -2 penalty. So that means the final score for this Orc attacking unit will be 8. So let's move over to the defending unit and see what its score is. So the defending unit, the Predator tank, has a defensive value of 8. And in this particular situation, it doesn't have any extra bonuses or penalties, and so its final score is also 8. And if the attacker and defender are tied, then the victory goes to the attacking unit. So the Predator tank takes a hit. Next, the Orc player needs to roll to determine what on the Predator tank has been damaged. So the Orc player rolls a die, and they roll a 5. The Predator tank has the red profile of damage markers, and so it gains this red marker, which means that the primary weapon for the Predator tank has been destroyed and can no longer be used for the rest of the game. If in a subsequent action that Predator tank were to take a hit in the same place, then it would become a wreck. So that brings us to the end of this first tutorial on firing. There's quite a bit more though to cover in terms of firing. We've yet to look at fire on the move, firing at buildings, throwing grenades, indirect fire, so there's a lot more that needs to be covered, and I'll do that in a follow-up tutorial. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.